Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is a thrilling, terrifying story entitled, I Wish I Never Went into the Forest Behind My House. Let's get straight into that. All throughout my childhood, we lived in the same exact house. It was a modest brick house with 3 rooms, 2 bathrooms and a wooden staircase that would let out tiny creaks with every step you took. Our parents' room was on the first floor and my room was on the second floor. I didn't have any siblings, so the third room was just a spare room we had in case we had any visitors. Our house was always my safe place, and even now it is the only thing that has kept me alive this long. Our house is placed on the outside section of a small neighbourhood. We have houses to the front and the side of ours, but behind our house we have the woods. For some reason, I always loved going into the forest and going in as far as I could possibly get. Of course, I would use a piece of chalk to mark trees so I could find my way back easily the first couple of times I went in the forest. The woods became my second home by the time I was 10 years old. Whenever any of my friends would come over, we would go into my house, pack up as many snacks, comic books and matches as we could and march into the forest. For several hours we would walk around the forest and try to find the coolest thing possible. One time I found a dead deer, but it was normally uneventful. Once we all got tired enough, we would pitch our tents up, stuff our faces with snacks while reading our comic books, and lastly we would try to scare each other with the scariest story possible before slowly drifting off to sleep. Our scary stories were nowhere close to the stories found on this subreddit, but one story in particular was our favourite. It was a story told by our fathers. There is a creature that lurks within our town, and it preys on small children. No one really knows what it looks like. All they know is that it looks like a shadow and is far taller than anyone in our town. It has claws meant to skin children and 2 white circles where the eyes should be. We don't know what it wants, but it seems to only attack small children. You never know when the creature will come, but it usually happens when a child is by himself. Our parents told us to stay together whenever we were out in the forest because it could be out there with us. I would be the one to tell the story, and after I finish a made-up tale of a little kid getting taken by the creature, we would look around the tent to make sure it wasn't near us. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys are wondering why we didn't have any parental supervision during this, but our neighbourhood, as well as our town, was extremely safe. There are around 300 people in it and everyone around knows each other. Shit, the craziest thing that ever happened in our town was when Gus, the town's drunk, grabbed our English teacher's ass at the grocery store. She made him publicly apologise in front of the whole town in the next town meeting. Well, might as well introduce myself. My name is Chris Green. I am now an 18-year-old recent high school graduate. I've had the same 2 friends, Joseph Stinson and Gregory Miles. We did almost everything together. On the weekdays, we would go to my house after school ended, do our homework, and watch a couple of shows before they went back to their houses for supper. On Saturday, we would meet up at my house at around 6 p.m. and go into the woods for our weekly camping trip when the weather was good enough. Last week, we graduated high school on a Friday and planned for our last trip to the woods the next day. We hadn't gone to the woods for about a year before that due to our hectic schedules, so we planned on making it the best we could possibly make it. We all met up on Saturday around 4 p.m. and started to grill up as many hot dogs and hamburgers as we could. Once we were done grilling, we packed up a couple of bags of chips, 2 packs of cookies and a 12-pack of beer. Yes, our parents let us drink beer as long as we don't drink it in a stranger's house. Joseph was a bit more quiet than usual, but Greg and I talked like we normally did. Shit. We figured it was because Joseph was the only one in our town going to an out-of-state college. I'd be nervous too. After walking around for about an hour, Joseph looked around us and said, "Man, I don't know why, but I'm starting to feel nervous as hell. Is it cool if we just set up our tent here and chill?" I looked over at Greg and he nodded his head before saying, "Sure, man. You nervous about that huge move next month?" Joseph nodded his head and quietly helped us set up the tent. Once we got the tent set up and ate a couple of bites of food, Joseph started to look like his normal self again. Soon, we were joking around and talking like we used to. Joseph talked about how he was going to do college and get an English degree so he could come back and teach in our own town. Greg talked about how he wanted to take over his dad's bakery, and I talked about how I was going to work at the grocery store and save up money so I could go to college in a couple of years. Before we knew it, it was around 11 p.m. and the beer that we had brought was now a pile of empty cans in the middle of our tent. We were all a bit tired, so we quietly sat in the corners of our tent and played with our phones. I don't really know when I fell asleep, but the distant sound of a high-pitched screech woke me up. Confused, I looked around the tent and saw that they were both asleep. My phone vibrated a couple of seconds later, and I sat up and checked my phone. It was around 3 in the morning, and I had a text message from my father. "If you hear the sound again, you need to get up and run as fast as you can back home." My God. I woke Joseph and Greg up and showed them the text. Greg rubbed his eyes while asking, "What the fuck? What noise is he talking about?" I shook my head and whispered, "Shit, man. I don't know what kind of sound it was. It was some type of screech." We sat in the middle of the tent for around an hour before I heard the sound again. It sounded a lot closer this time, and the sound made me feel like my body was about to burst into a million pieces. It was the loudest sound I have ever heard in my life, and it felt like the screech was getting more and more high-pitched with each second. The look on their faces told me that they had heard the sound too. I was the first to get out the tent, and I instantly started running towards my house. Greg caught up with me, and I took a brief second to look behind us and make sure that Joseph was following us. It was dark, and I couldn't really see him, but the stars lit off a light small enough to where I could see the outline of his body. I turned back around and kept running as quickly as I could. After around 20 minutes of running, we were about 10 minutes away from my house. I was dead exhausted, but I pushed my body to keep running. Greg grabbed onto my shoulder and shouted out, "Dude, I think we can rest for a couple of seconds." I shook my head and shouted back, "Fuck no, dude. Are you fucking nuts? We need to get the fuck out of these woods as quickly as we can." He let out a frustrated scream before he stopped running and said, "Fuck it. Dude, we're running from something that probably isn't there. It was probably some bullshit alarm. I'm resting, man. You go back home by yourself." I stopped running and wiped the sweat off my forehead. Joseph came out of nowhere and silently stood behind him before dropping to the ground like a thin blanket. My legs reacted before my mind could process what had happened. I could hear Greg screaming the entire time I ran back to my house. I opened the door, ran into the living room and sat down on the couch trying just to figure out what the fuck happened. My father walked out of his room and I could see relief flood across his face. He ran up to me and hugged me while saying, "I always knew you were the one to survive the sacrifice. I hoped it was you and thank God for keeping you alive." It's been 5 days since our last trip to the woods. The parents of Joseph and Greg came by the next day and talked to my parents. They stared at me with a look of jealousy before they started to walk back to their house. The police stopped by that afternoon and walked into the woods. They walked out with the skin of my once two best friends, folded into neat squares. Their funeral was 2 days ago. It was unlike any funeral I have seen. The whole town gathered together and came to our house. My parents led them to the backyard and we all stood in front of the forest. The fathers of Joseph and Greg made a small campfire and threw the skin of their sons into the fire. I could hear the whole town let out a collective sigh of relief. The night after the funeral, my father sat with me in the kitchen. He was silent for the first couple of minutes, but finally let out a short breath before saying, "Our town has a deal with a creature that none of us have seen. For every new generation, we have to make a sacrifice. We send 3 kids out into the designated area, and it will choose which 2 it wants. We don't know when it will come. Sometimes it will come when the children are as young as 12, and sometimes it will come as late as it did with you guys. Before you start to hate me, please know that we don't choose who the 3 children are. They are chosen by who it is closest to, the area, and who the child chooses to befriend." I stared at my uneaten dinner and said, "Then why don't we just leave? Why do you choose to stay here?" He put his hand on my arm before letting out a sigh and saying, "The ones who choose to leave always come back to our town before the day is over, in the same condition your friends were in. We can't leave. You can't leave. Instead, you need to pray that your child lives past its youth. I'm not here to ask for help. I'm just here to give you guys a warning. If you happen to see a small town called Somerset Valley and you are in the mountainous parts of North Carolina, please don't go into the town. We can't leave, and you can't either if you enter. My name is Chris Green, and I pray that my future child will live." Wow, that concludes tonight's story, guys. I hope you really enjoyed that one as much as I did reading it. Very interesting place. From what I hear, Somerset Valley is a place of all kinds of mystery and scary cryptids. Please do like, comment and share. And remember, folks, be safe, not sorry.